Good morning, everybody. Did everybody get an overview handout? Okay. There should also be, painful prophecies activity. That'll be for you to look at. It's in fine print. I messed up when I sent it to Autumn to be printed, and I didn't make it a full thing, so that's on me. Today we're going to do continuing to talk about David, and kind of a little bit of a review, David's sin. So David initially responded to his own sin of lust. What did it do? What kind of happened? Kind of like a whirlpool thing, but he committed sin with Bathsheba, and then what did he do? They progressed more. He set up and messed up Uriah and murdered him, and then his sin just continued to go out of control. And that's what happens with a lot of us when we sin. We're like, oh man, I fell off the wagon, I did this, and then it spirals out of control, and you get deeper and deeper and deeper into the sin cycle. And that's what David did. And I think one of the key things that I take away from that is having godly brothers and sisters. When we have godly brothers and sisters who call us on our sin and our problems and our issues, and that's what Nathan did. Nathan called David on his sin, and David was receptive and truly repented of what he had done. So we're going to kind of talk about Absalom and how he rebels, and we're going to do some scripture jumping, and we're going to read the story of Absalom is just crazy, and David's kids, and I am so glad that mine haven't been this crazy. Okay, so 2 Samuel 12 is just a real quick verse. And verses 11 and 12. Thus says Yahweh, behold, I will raise up evil against you from your own household. I will even take your wives from before your sight and give them to your companion. And he will lie with your wives in the sight of this son. Indeed, you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. And this was a judgment pronounced against David for his sin by God. So we're going to kind of do this jump thing. We're going to jump over several years from 2 Samuel 12 and 13. A quick synopsis of this. After the first child of David and Bathsheba died, Solomon was born. Joab and David conquered another king, expanding his territory. And then there's the disgraceful story of David's son Amnon, who raped his half-sister Tamar. David did nothing about this evil act, so Tamar's brother Absalom finally killed Amnon in revenge. David and his other sons mourned the death, and Absalom fled far north to Geshur, and that's east of the Sea of Galilee. And after 3 years, David allows Absalom to return to Jerusalem at Joab's request, and that is where we will pick up our story. So we'll be in 2 Samuel 14, starting in verses 21 to 33. So David brings Absalom back. Then the king said to Joab, "Behold, now I have done this thing. Go therefore and bring back the young man Absalom." And Joab fell on his face to the ground, prostrated himself, and blessed the king. Then Joab said, "Today your servant knows that I have found favor in your sight, O my lord the king, and that the king has performed the word of his servant." So Joab arose and went to Geshur and brought Absalom to Jerusalem. However, the king said, "Let him return to his house, and let him not see my face." So Absalom turned to his own house and did not see the king's face. Now in all Israel was no one as handsome as Absalom, so highly praised, for the sole of his foot to the top of his head, there was no defect in him. When he shaved the hair of his head, and it was at the end of every year that he shaved it, it was so heavy on him, so he shaved it. It weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels by the king's weight. And to Absalom there were born 3 sons and 1 daughter, whose name was Tamar. She was a woman of beautiful appearance. Now Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem and did not see the king's face. Then Absalom sent for Joab to send him to the king, but he was not willing to come to him. So he went again a second time, but he was not willing to come. Therefore he said to his servants, "See, Joab's portion of the land is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go and set it on fire." So Absalom's servants set the portion of land on fire. And then Joab arose and came to Absalom at his house and said to him, "Why have your servants set my portion of land on fire?" And Absalom answered Joab, "Because I sent for you, saying, 'Come here,' that I may send you to the king to say, 'Why have I come from Geshur? It would be better for me to still be there.' So now let me see the king's face, and if there is iniquity in me, let him put me to death." So Joab came to the king and told him, and he called for Absalom. Thus he came to the king and prostrated himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. I thought that I read this story earlier this week and was going through it and did some research. Does anybody happen to know how much weight 200 shekels is actually? 5 pounds, exactly, 5.03 pounds. That dude had some hair. I don't think I get that much off my Cocker Spaniels when we groom them. I mean, that's a lot of hair. And he was extremely vain about this and his looks. So when David and Absalom immediately reconciled? No, exactly. No, they were not. They were separated. And so how long did they stay at odds with each other? A couple years. Yeah. They stayed at odds for 2 years. So it's actually been, so adding the time together with that's actually 5 years since he murdered his brother, Amnon. So how is Absalom described in the passage? Handsome. Okay, so they say he is the most handsome man in Israel and has no blemish anywhere on his body, and his hair was robust. I find that kind of interesting that there was no blemish on his body, but his spirit and his countenance was severely blemished. He had all kinds of sin and things that he was hiding. What did Absalom do when Joab wouldn't pay attention to him? He took and burned his fields. So I guess he, in my opinion, that was acting much like a spoiled teenager. You're not going to listen to me, so I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to set your fields on fire, and then you'll listen to me. So what can we assume about David and Absalom's relationship going forward in this passage? Are they on a good footing? No, they're not. Well, I'm sorry. I got ahead of myself here. So Absalom went in with David and prostrated himself and humbled himself. So right now they are in good standing. And we're going to continue to see what's going to happen here. So in 2 Samuel 15, we're going to read verses 1 through 6. Now it happened afterwards that Absalom prepared for himself a chariot and horses and 50 men as runners before him. And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way to the gate. And when any man had a case to come to the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" And he would say, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." And then Absalom would say to him, "See, your words are good and right, but no man listens to you on the part of the king." Then Absalom would say, "Oh, that one would appoint me judge in the land, that every man who has a case or judgment could come to me, and I would justify him." And when a man came near to prostrate himself before him, he would send forth his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. And in this manner, Absalom dealt with all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole away the hearts of the men of Israel. Absalom is being deceitful here. And what is the significance of the details in verse 1? It says, he had the chariot and horses and 50 men as runners before him. So why do we think he did that? Okay, so Absalom's building himself up. He's got runners, he's got chariots, he's building himself up. So something bigger is coming along. And then when he had men that would run before him, these were guys that would go out and announce his presence and serve as like a forward guard for him. And then Absalom would continue to hang out at the gate of the city. And he was subverting King David. So all these people would come in with their disputes, and he told them that there was no one to hear them, and he would be the one. He would take over this spot. And Absalom was doing this so that he desired to sit on the king's place of judgment. He wanted to be king. So this is not cool. Pretty much, yes. He was campaigning and he was stealing votes. So I'm going to jump here real quick to 2 Samuel 15, verse 13 to 17. So, and then an informant came to David saying, "The hearts of the men of Israel have followed Absalom." So David said to all the servants who were with him at Jerusalem, "Arise and let us flee, for otherwise there will be no escape for us from Absalom. Go in haste, lest he overtake us hastily and drive calamity on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword." Then the king's servants said to the king, "Behold, your servants are ready to go and to do whatever my lord and king chooses." So the king went out of the household with him, but the king left 10 concubines to keep the house. And the king went out and all the people with him, and they stopped at the last house. So Absalom's gone to Hebron. He's got gathering of men. So what is David afraid of? I'm sorry? Yes, he's afraid he's going to be overthrown. He's going to lose the kingdom of Israel. The figure of speech that he used when he was describing this, he said that they were going to strike the city with the edge of the sword. So that's extremely violent. It's going to be an all-out military attack. So David responds to the threat. He orders all of his servants to flee the city. He takes his household. The servants were all on the side. They were ready to do whatever David directed. So he left behind. Who did he leave behind? 10 concubines. That's not all he left behind, though. And they were there to take care of the house. There are likely thousands of people with David as he fled. Verse 18 mentions 600 Gittites plus others. So that's quite a bit of people. And one thing to remember, a lot of times when they're talking about numbers in the Old Testament, they only count the men. They don't count the women, the children, the servants, and so on. So you don't get an accurate, they only took 600. Well, each guy might have had 10 or 12 wives, and the kids associated with this and grandparents and all of this aren't included in those numbers. So David, when they left, David instructed the priests to leave the Ark of the Covenant in the city. And it's clear that through this that David was trusting in God for the outcome, whether he would be replaced by Absalom or return to reign, as seen in the statements in verses 25 and 26. He also wanted to protect the city as he left so the battle would not occur there. As he was leaving, he was helped by several loyal servants, including Zadok, Abiathar, and Hushai, but he was also cursed by a man, Shimei. As Absalom entered Jerusalem to take the throne, he found no resistance. Hushai stayed behind, pretending loyalty to Absalom in order to undermine him. Now, as Absalom sought counsel, Ahithophel and Hushai both presented battle plans, and the Lord used Hushai's plan to let David escape, and Ahithophel hanged himself after Absalom rejected his counsel. Now, after gathering an army from all of Israel, Absalom pursued David across the Jordan to Mahanaim, and David organized his troops with Joab, Abishai, and Ittai. Though he wanted to join them in battle, his men asked him to stay behind for his protection. So we're going to skip again for some more. We just kind of did a overview of 16 and 17. And we're going to jump over to chapter 18 now. So 2 Samuel 18, and I'm going to read verses 5 through 17. Now the king, David, commanded Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." And all the people heard when the king commanded all the commanders concerning Absalom. Then the people went out into the field to meet Israel, and the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. And the people of Israel were defeated there before the servants of David, and the slaughter there that day was great, 20,000 men. And the battle there were scattered over the whole countryside, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. Then Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Now Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak. So he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him passed onward. Then a certain man saw it, and he told Joab and said, "Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak." Then Joab said to the man who had told him, "Now behold, you saw him. Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? And I would have given you 10 pieces of silver and a belt." So the man said to Joab, "Even if I should receive 1,000 pieces of silver in my hand, I would not send forth my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, saying, 'Keep for me the young man of Absalom.' Otherwise, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. And Joab said, I will not wait around here before you. So he took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. And 10 young men who carried Joab's armor gathered around and struck Absalom and put him to death. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the people returned from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained his people. And they took Absalom and cast him into a deep pit in the forest, and set over him a very great heap of stones, and all Israel fled, each to his tent. So what command did David give to his generals regarding Absalom? Go easy on him. Why do you think this was? Sorry? Yes, he loved him. He was his son. Kind of like when our children do silly and stupid things. They sin, they fall short, they make mistakes. We still love them. They have a place to land. They have a place to fall. I don't think David condoned his actions, but I think he loved him. He was still his son. So the commanders weren't the only ones who knew this. All the people heard, as we saw a little bit later on. So where did this battle take place? In the woods, in the forest. I really didn't realize that they had forests. I thought this whole area was just desert. But they have forests, oak trees. So this is an area along the River Jordan between the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. And they chose this area because David had a much smaller force, and he had been able to fight more effectively using trees and so on. So Absalom's followers were referred to as men of Israel. And men of Israel that died that day were 20,000. I think the important thing there, it says here that not all of the casualties were from the battle. The forest devoured more people than the sword. We don't have an explicit statement that seems to be an example of God killing these men in the forest by some unstated means, but it could have been beasts, pits, or other things may have been present. And that's why that the forest gave David the fighting advantage. So kind of like watching one of these fantasy movies, Lord of the Rings or something, and people running into trees and falling into pits and so on. So how did Absalom suddenly find himself defenseless? Where did he end up? Hanging in a tree. He was riding his mule, and his head got caught in a tree, suspending him in the air by branches. So back in them times, they didn't have saddles for their horses or mules, so he was bareback. So when he got hung up in this tree, mule just carried on and just left him suspended there. So what do we know about Absalom that would explain how he got stuck? Hair. We learned that Absalom's abundant hair, that he only cut it once a year, and it would seem that his hair was caught in the branches. So that's a lot of hair. I can't even fathom. Yeah. So his item of vanity with his hair is what actually is his downfall. And pun intended, non-pun intended, it strung him up. So the soldier who found Absalom hanging in the tree, why didn't he kill him? Exactly. So he listened to the king. The king had said, don't kill him. So Joab stuck 3 javelins in his heart, and then Joab's armor bearers also struck him. And then they just took his body and buried it in a heap of stones in a pile in the forest. So I can imagine that David's not going to be too awfully happy about this. Joab wanted to get news of the victory of the king, so he sent a Cushite to carry the news, but he also wanted Zadok's son Ahimaaz to carry the message at his own request. So we can see this battle carried out. Didn't go the way David wanted to, but he's safe from his son. So let's look at 2 Samuel, and we're going to read verses 28 to 33 now. Chapter 18, I'm sorry. And Ahimaaz called and said to the king, "Peace." And he prostrated himself before the king with his face to the ground. And he said, "Blessed is Yahweh your God, who has delivered up the men who lifted their hands against my lord the king." Then the king said, "Is there peace with the young man Absalom?" And Ahimaaz said, "When Joab sent the king's servant and your servant, I saw a great tumult, but I do not know what it was." Then the king said, "Turn aside and stand here." So he turned aside and stood still. Behold, the Cushite arrived, and the Cushite said, "Let my lord the king receive good news, for Yahweh has judged to save you this day from the hand of all of those who rose up against you." Then the king said to the Cushite, "Is there peace with the young man Absalom?" And the Cushite answered, "Let the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be as that young man." Then the king trembled and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. Thus he said as he walked, "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I have died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son." So Ahimaaz approached David humbly, bowing before him, announcing the defeat of those who came against the king. But was Ahimaaz honest with King David about his question about Absalom? He kind of beat around the bush. He was deceptive and indirect, saying that he saw a great commotion, but he did not know what it was. Even if he wasn't a witness, Joab had told him in verse 20 that Absalom was dead. So this Cushite, the land south of Egypt in modern-day Ethiopia is where the land of Cush, and of course that's one of the grandsons of Noah. So how was the Cushite's message similar to that of Ahimaaz? He came in and he was humble, and he announced the victory in a similar way, and that God had delivered David from the men who rose up against him. He didn't come out and say that your son is dead, but he did use an euphemism to soften the answer that Absalom was dead. And it's clear that David understood what he meant because he began weeping and mourning. So, what expression did David use to express his grief? He said he wished that he was dead. He could take the place of his son. And that created a great tension between Joab and David, and we'll get into that here later in chapter 19. And we're going to skip that so we can, if you want to read that when you're at home. So through all of these events, David has failed at many points in raising his son Absalom. He let him run his own way without bringing any discipline or punishment to Absalom for his continual sins. And this kind of emboldened Absalom, and he kind of took the rope and he ran with it, and now he's got this idea in his head that he wants to overtake his father, and that was thwarted finally. While there is no direct mention of the idea, how do you see God's character displayed in the passage we have just studied? Kind of talked about it a little bit this morning. God is faithful. He upholds David as king. He was merciful to David in sparing his life. And in a great moment of irony, the pride of Absalom, his abundant hair, has led to his downfall by getting tangled in the tree. Based on his actions, Absalom's death brought justice to him. It may not have been carried out in the most humane way, but Absalom deserved to die for seeking to overthrow the king whom God had put into power. And God allowed David's reign to continue in Jerusalem, but not for much longer. So this there's a comment that was made earlier about things that are done for one reason and meant for good. And I think this is one of those that Absalom meant it for his own gain, but God meant it for good. He was able to use that. We're gonna. So, does anybody have any questions about Absalom and David and the story that we just talked about? It's interesting, the history stuff. All right, we're going to move on to another mistake that David makes, and that is the census. So we're going to jump again to 2 Samuel 24. And talk about this one. So some years after the incident with Absalom, and this incident leads to disaster. So I will go ahead and start reading chapter 24, 1 through 17. And again, the anger of Yahweh burned against Israel, and it incited David against them to say, "Go and number Israel and Judah." So the king sent to Joab, the commander of the military force who was with him, "Go about now through all the tribes of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, and take a census of the people, that I may know the total count of people." But Joab said to the king, "Now may Yahweh your God add to the people 100 times as many as they are, while the eyes of my lord the king still see. But why does my lord the king delight in this thing?" Nevertheless, the king's word stood strong against Joab and against the commanders of the military force. So Joab and the commanders of the military force went out from the presence of the king to take a census of the people of Israel. They crossed the Jordan and camped in Aroer, that's a tough one to say, and the right side of the city that is in the middle of the valley of Gad toward Jazer. Then they came to Gilead and the land of Tatim Hadshi, and they came to Dan Jan and around to Sidon. And they came to the fortified city of Tyre and all the cities of the Hivites and the Canaanites, and they went through and went out of the south of Judah to Beersheba. So they had gone through the whole land, and they came to Jerusalem at the end of 9 months and 20 days. And Joab gave the total count of the census of the people to the king. And there were in Israel 800,000 valiant men who drew the sword, and the men of Judah were 500,000 men. Then David's heart struck him after he counted the people. So David said to Yahweh, "I have sinned greatly in what I have done. But now, O Yahweh, please take away my iniquity. Take away the iniquity of your slave, for I have acted very foolishly." Then David arose in the morning, and the word of Yahweh came to the prophet Gad, David's seer, saying, "Go and speak to David. Thus says Yahweh, I am offering you 3 things. Choose for yourself one of them, and I will do that to you." So Gad came to David and told him and said to him, "Shall 7 years of famine come to you in your land? Or will you flee 3 months before your adversaries while they pursue you? Or shall there be 3 days pestilence in your land? Now, know and see what word I shall return to him who sent me." Then David said to Gad, I am in great distress. Let us now fall into the hand of Yahweh, for his compassions are abundant, but do not let me fall into the hand of man. So Yahweh sent a pestilence against Israel from the morning until the appointed time, and 70,000 men of the people from Dan to Beersheba died. Then the angel sent forth his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it. And Yahweh relented of the calamity and said to the angel who destroyed the people, It is enough, now relax your hand. And the angel of Yahweh was by the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. Then David spoke to Yahweh when he saw the angel who was striking down the people and said, Behold, it is I who have sinned, and it is I who have done unrighteousness. But these sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand be against me and my father's house. So, who did David send to conduct the census? He sent Joab out to do that, and Joab wasn't willing. He didn't want to do it. He told David, tried to stop him, confronted him about it. So the census took 9 months and 20 days. 800,000 men in Israel, that's the 10 northern tribes, and 500,000 in Judah. Did the census count all the people? Nope, it didn't count the women and the children. So we've got 1,300,000 soldiers. He was basically, what David was doing was checking his army. How big an army do I have? If I'm going to go into battle, I want to know how many troops I've got. So why did God want the census to happen? Right? His anger was kindled against Israel. He didn't want the census to happen. Well, they don't say what the sin is, but there's some kind of sin that Israel has done that has God's anger kindled against them.
But was it against Israel or was it against David? He wanted David to know that whatever David needed to win, that he would provide.
Yeah.
He just wanted David to be satisfied that he would take care of it.
Yes, and it.
It was always a test. David was always testing.
Yes, he was always testing. What I have here doesn't say specifically, but that the anger of the Lord was against Israel.
To be fair, Israel doesn't have a really good history of doing what they're supposed to do.
No, Israel does not have a really good history of doing what they're supposed to. And part of in Exodus, there's, I'll get over here real quick. David didn't do everything that you're supposed to do in the census. Basically, all he did was went out, counted heads, and came home. And so here in verse 12 of Exodus 30, it says, when you take a census of the sons of Israel to number them, then each of them you shall give a price of atonement for yourself to Yahweh when you number them, so that there will be no plague among them when you number them. So basically there's a poll tax for the numbered individuals. So he didn't do this. He was greedy for himself, wanted to count them out. Okay, these are my troops. This is where we're headed. And there's just a whole bunch more in that whole chapter. And it's a long chapter, too. But basically, he didn't do the census the way that God had commanded them to do it in Exodus. And that's another reason that God was mad at them for that. So David sinned against God. the prophet Gad spoke to him, and he gave him the three choices: pestilence.
That's what was bad too. He had to send him a messenger instead of just telling him.
Yeah. Yeah. That's when you know you've really done something bad, is the person you're mad at won't even talk to you. They send somebody else to talk to you. So 70,000 people died from this pestilence. I don't think we see these numbers on paper, and we don't really get a grasp of it. 20,000 people in one battle, or 70,000 people died of pestilence, and
70,000 people in that
no, population of Mattoon is 18,000. I mean, the entire town, or so, a good football game, it's got 70,000 people in it, and just they're gone. And it's just, our brains don't fathom, my brain doesn't fathom that. So why do you think the punishment was on the people and not on David? I kind of agree with you, and it goes back to what we were talking about a little bit ago. Israel had done something that angered God. So there was sin that they were accounting for, and David's sin was also being taken into account. The king was the head of Israel. And as such, his actions could have repercussions, good and bad, on the people he ruled over. So the idea of this headship is somewhat absent from our Western individualized thinking. So David commits the sin, and the people pay. And that's not something we're used to here. Yeah, take me instead. Let's end this suffering. Yeah. God relented on the pestilence. The angel approached Jerusalem. He was getting ready to head in there. God was indeed merciful and suspended the punishment. So how did David respond to the suffering of his people? He asked him, go ahead and bring it to me rather than taking out on the rest of my people. So David's life gives us many examples of how the failings of man and the mercy of God intersect. And as a consequence, for David's prior sins, Absalom rose up to overthrow his father, but was himself killed. And this initial rift in the kingdom actually had a ripple effect after David died. There's an allegiance to the unified throne in Jerusalem, and that would continue to just make things unbalanced. And all of this you can connect back to David's sin in previous years. I don't know if I've mentioned it here before, but sin is a lot like throwing a rock into a pond. It ripples out, and it continues to have an effect. Something I did when I was 12 years old may still be having an effect on my life today, and it just continues on like that. And this is a clear representation of how David's sin with Bathsheba continues to affect the kingdom of Israel, and I think it continues to affect the kingdom of Israel to this day. And it just continues to play out over and over and over and over again. So is there any questions or comments regarding today? Yes. Yeah. He is gracious and he is merciful. And, you know, I'm guilty of this myself, pointing the finger at Israel and saying, my goodness, you guys are so stubborn and so stiff-necked. And look at you. You sin and you sin and you sin, and then you cry out to God. And I do that every day. I do it every night. I'm praying every night for the sins that I've committed during the day. And the big difference is we can go to God and pray directly to him And we have that relationship, whereas theirs was through priests and through their king and so on. So we are much more fortunate in that. And we have a merciful God.
To me, it seems that even to this day, Israel, the Israeli people have such horrible things still done to them.
They do. And it's continued from the sin of the fathers from beginning. And yes. There's not. And it's sad. It's very sad. Heart-wrenching to see it happening and knowing that they're God's people. And hopefully they will come to their senses and accept him as their God and be reunited. So let me close this in prayer, and then we will go about our days. Father in heaven, we thank you that we could come before you this morning and worship you through your word. We thank you for your word and how it is so corrective and informative, and that we have all of it to look through for history and guidance. We thank you that you are our God and that we are your people. And we ask you to be with us and let this word penetrate our hearts and convict us. We love you, and we ask it all in Jesus' name. Amen.